The 17th century was an era where medicine was less a science and more a blend of alchemy and superstition. In this world, physicians were learned men, debating the balance of bodily fluids and interpreting ancient texts. And surgeons? They were considered mere dirty barber-surgeons. They didn't attend universities. Their knowledge, if it could even be called that, was passed down from master to apprentice, often in conditions of complete unsanitary chaos. There was no anatomy, no scientific basis, just brute force and a sharp knife. They were despised, their craft deemed lowly. Then came the year 1686. The king fell ill. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the living embodiment of absolute power, suffered from a fistula. It was not only a tormenting, but also a deeply shameful affliction. Hundreds of physicians, dozens of methods, all were in vain. The court plunged into despair. That's when he appeared. Charles-François Félix, the king's surgeon, a man without a university degree. He proposed the unthinkable, radical surgical intervention to excise the ailment. This operation didn't just save the monarch's life, it became a watershed moment. It was the point when surgery, previously scorned, ascended to an independent, respected discipline. From a crude craft, it transformed into a field worthy of scientific study. Physicians, until then arrogant, were forced to admit that the crowned savior was not their scholarly debate, but the hand of a barber-surgeon. They began to study his methods, and universities opened their doors to this new knowledge. We tend to think of scientific progress as a chain of brilliant insights, flashes of light illuminating the path for great minds. But what if that's a myth? What if, at times, the greatest breakthroughs are born from pain, from a shameful disease no one could cure, from royal desperation? What if the history of medicine is written not only by reason, but also by the scalpel? The 17th century scalpel was an instrument of torture, a tool of ignorance. Medicine of that time didn't seek answers through observation. It sought them in ancient treatises, in dogmas that were 1,500 years old. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated. Any illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors, and treatment aimed to restore that balance through methods like bleeding to the point of fainting, emetics, and purgatives, all to expel the disease from the body. While therapists, those learned men, could shield themselves with Latin and philosophical debates, surgeons dealt with reality, with flesh and blood. Yet their methods were no less barbaric. The complete absence of anesthesia made every operation a nightmare. Patients were restrained, their screams muffled. The instruments? Often the same as those used for splitting wood, and with no disinfection whatsoever. Wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons, or doused with boiling oil, supposedly to cleanse the damaged tissues. More often than not, this led to agonizing death from shock or sepsis. Pus was even considered a laudable phenomenon, its appearance interpreted as a sign that the wound was maturing and cleansing itself. In reality, it was a sure path to putrefaction and demise. In this world where pain was the norm and death a frequent outcome, the human body remained terra incognita, an unknown land. Anatomical studies, if conducted at all, were rare, and their results didn't always reach practitioners. Every time a surgeon picked up a knife, he operated almost blindly, relying on scant experience and prejudice. Patients, even the most noble, knew that a visit to a healer was not a promise of recovery. It was a deadly lottery. And it was into this world, steeped in ignorance and pain, where every illness was a death sentence, that a man entered who did not seek answers in ancient tomes. His name was Charles-François Félix. He was not a learned man. He hadn't sat in university halls debating humors. His teachers were different, his knowledge hard-won. Félix came from the guild of barber-surgeons, the very ones physicians despised, who engaged in crude labor. He learned not from books, but at the operating table. He learned by observing thousands of wounds, hundreds of festering sores, and the agonizing deaths of those treated by cauterization or bloodletting. His youth was spent in a Parisian hospital, a place not merely for the sick, but a purgatory, where people weren't dying but were slowly killed by ignorance. Infection was not just a risk, but an inevitability, and the cries of patients were the constant backdrop. Every day, he witnessed human bodies, like unexplored lands, subjected to barbaric experiments. He saw how laudable pus heralded not healing, but putrefaction. He watched theoretical doctors throw up their hands when their abstract schemes shattered against the reality of human flesh. Felix could not accept this. He could not reconcile himself with death being the norm and suffering the only thing medicine could offer. His experience was unique. He didn't just mend bodies, he studied them, not by dogma, but by how tissues reacted to the knife, to the dressing, to medicine. He began to ask questions. Why did some wounds heal while others didn't? Why did the same treatment kill one person and save another? These questions were heresy to those who believed in the infallibility of ancient authorities. But for Felix, they were the only path to understanding. He was a practitioner, and his belief was built on observation, not blind faith. He was a man who, unlike many, did not close his eyes to the horrifying truth. He faced it squarely. And it was this that made him the one who could challenge the entire system. He was the one ready to seek new paths, when everyone else merely repeated old mistakes. Charles-François Félix didn't just observe. He acted. He understood that saving the Sun King required not just a bold step, but a precise, refined method, a method that didn't yet exist. He started from the very beginning, with the instrument. Scalpels of that era were crude and unwieldy. They tore tissues rather than cutting them cleanly. Felix set out to create something different, something capable of working with jeweler's precision, where only butcher knives had been wielded before. For months, he worked in his workshop, forging, sharpening, polishing. He sought the ideal curve, the perfect sharpening angle. He knew that every fraction of a millimeter, every degree of blade inclination would matter. The result was a curved scalpel, thin, razor, sharp, an instrument crafted specifically for one incredibly complex task, the excision of a fistula. But an instrument alone was not enough. A technique was also needed. A fistula operation was not just a simple cut. It was a labyrinth of festering tracts that had to be located and completely removed. The slightest mistake, and the disease would return or kill the patient. King Louis was not just a man, he was a symbol. His life was the life of France. Felix could not afford to err. He could not take risks. And so he made a decision that would have shocked any learned physician. He decided to practice on living people. He began performing operations on hospital patients suffering from a similar ailment, those who had already been written off, who had nothing left to lose. This was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of desperate, brutal necessity. He transformed hospital beds into his personal laboratory. Each operation was a lesson. He tried. He erred. He learned. He refined his movements, studying anatomy not from old books, but from the living, pulsating body. He perfected his technique, searching for that one, uniquely correct path through the damaged tissues. He worked quickly and precisely, minimizing pain as much as possible without anesthesia. Thus, a new operation, a new technique, was born. Felix discovered that if the fistula was completely excised down to healthy tissue, and the wound was carefully sutured rather than cauterized, healing occurred much better. The pus disappeared, the wounds cleaned. Patients who had previously been condemned to a slow, agonizing death began to recover, one after another, 10, 20, 30 people. All of them were living proof, living witnesses that Felix had found the key. He didn't just treat, he healed. He didn't just create an instrument, he created a precedent. He proved that surgery was not merely a craft, but a science based on precision, observation, and the continuous search for better solutions. On this foundation, built from steel and human flesh, he was ready to face the challenge that would change history. His readiness was not bravado. It was forged in the purgatory of Parisian hospitals. Where other doctors quoted ancient tomes, Felix trusted only his own eyes. He saw how laudable pus led to slow death. He saw how cauterization turned wounds into charred pieces of flesh. His mind did not accept the dogmas that killed. He sought answers not in dusty treatises, but in the reaction of the living body. This was empiricism in its purest form: observation, experiment, result. Every patient he operated on became his teacher. Failures did not break him, but forced him to analyze. Why did this wound not heal? Where was the mistake? Perhaps the incision was not deep enough, or, conversely, too extensive. He experimented with the scalpel's angles, with the pressure of his hand, with every movement. He learned to recognize the slightest nuances of tissues, their reaction to intervention. This was a slow, brutal process of trial and error, paid for by the pain and lives of those who had nothing left to lose. Felix did not merely repeat actions, he perfected them. He transformed every failure into a valuable lesson. It was from this experience that the understanding was born that the instrument must become an extension of thought. His curved scalpel was not a random whim. It was the result of thousands of hours of observation, thousands of failed and successful incisions. He knew that for delicate work, one needed not a crude knife, but a blade capable of passing through the labyrinth of tissues with minimal damage. This instrument became the embodiment of his new approach: precision instead of force, understanding instead of blind action. When 30 patients, previously doomed to die, began to recover one after another, it became his scientific work. His publication was living people. Every healed patient was an argument that no academic debate could refute. He didn't just treat disease, he rewrote the rules. He proved that knowledge is born not from debates about humors, but from precise observation, methodical searching, and the ability to learn from every mistake. He was ready. His hands were honed. His mind was free from dogma. He carried within him not just a scalpel, but an entire new philosophy of healing. News of his radical methods, of his miraculous healings, spread throughout Paris and reached the ears of the medical faculty, the guardians of ancient wisdom, the self, proclaimed arbiters of healing. They listened with disbelief and outrage. Some barber-surgeon, without an education, dared to challenge their sacred traditions, dared to claim success where their scholarly treatises had failed. Their anger was furious. For centuries, the medical elite had despised surgeons. Now, one of them was healing the incurable. This was not progress. It was heresy, an assault on their very identity. Felix was not considered a healer. He was called a charlatan, a dangerous upstart. How could he disobey Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna? How could he reject the sacred balance of humors? They accused him of recklessness, of butchery. His insistence on deep, clean excisions, his refusal to cauterize wounds, his belief that laudable pus should drain rather than fester, all of it went against established dogmas. He kills with his knife, they whispered. He poisons the body with unnatural methods. The Paris medical faculty, a bastion of scholasticism, demanded that he be stopped immediately, threatening to revoke his license and expel him from city hospitals. They launched a campaign of ridicule, dismissing his patients' recoveries as mere coincidence or the result of dark forces. But Felix had powerful allies, his patients, the living proof of his genius. They became his chief defenders. Among them were influential figures at court. They had witnessed the king's slow, agonizing decline and seen their own relatives, condemned to death, return from the brink, thanks to this barber. These patrons, weary of the endless debates of learned doctors and their fruitless methods, began to speak out, defending Felix from academic wrath. Their argument was simple and compelling. Results speak louder than Latin. The king's suffering grew, his condition worsened. The royal physicians, despite their grand titles and complex theories, remained helpless. Their laxatives and bloodletting offered no relief, only weakness. The court plunged into despair. Pressure on the faculty intensified. Their scholarly arguments sounded hollow against the backdrop of a fading monarch. They could denounce Felix, but they could not heal the king. It was a war, not just of methods, but of world views. On one side, centuries of tradition, enshrined in dusty tomes, guarded by proud academics. On the other, one man, armed with a new instrument and a radical understanding born from direct observation. A man who dared to believe that the body held its own secrets, waiting to be discovered, not dictated by ancient texts. The stakes were immense. The fate of the king and, perhaps, the future of medicine itself. Everything hung in the balance. The moment of truth was approaching. November 18th, 1686. This day went down in history, not only for France but for all of medicine. King Louis XIV, exhausted by his ailment, made the riskiest decision of his life: to entrust it to Charles-François Félix, the barber, surgeon whom the medical faculty had recently called a charlatan. This was not merely a choice of method, it was a challenge to centuries of tradition. The operation took place in Versailles, in the royal chambers transformed into an improvised operating room. The most influential figures of the court and leading physicians were present, the very ones who had demanded Felix's expulsion just yesterday. Now they stood in silence, witnesses, or perhaps prosecutors. For the slightest error, the slightest misstep, and their prophecies would come true. Felix acted quickly and with intense focus. In his hands was not an ordinary scalpel, but the curved one he had forged for months. This instrument seemed an extension of his own will. The blade glided through the tissues precisely, without unnecessary movements. He did not cauterize. He did not pour boiling oil into the wound. He excised carefully, completely, removing every purulent tract. Then he gently sutured, just as he had learned on dozens of doomed patients. The tension in the room was unbearable, but Felix finished. The king was alive. And that was just the beginning. The next few days, weeks, each hour was a test. The court held its breath. Physicians awaited failure. But no pus appeared. The wound did not become inflamed. Healing progressed, slowly but surely, and most importantly, without the complications that always accompanied traditional treatment. On January 15, 1687, Louis XIV, the Sun King, appeared in public for the first time after the operation. He was healed. The entire court rejoiced, and with it, all of France. This was not merely the recovery of a monarch. It was a triumph. The triumph of one man and his revolutionary approach. Charles-François Félix, the outcast, the barber, was now a hero, an unquestionable authority. His name was spoken everywhere, with respect, with reverence. The Paris medical faculty was forced into silence. Their dogmas, their ancient treatises, their arrogance, all collapsed in the face of the undeniable fact. The king was saved not by a debate on humors, but by a scalpel and the hand of a surgeon. Surgery, once despised, now took its rightful place, alongside medicine, or even above it, for it had proven its effectiveness on its most important patient. The doors of universities, closed just yesterday, opened for the study of new methods, for the acceptance of new knowledge born not from books, but from practice, from courage, and from pain. Felix's victory over the king's illness was not just a healing, it reshaped the medical landscape. Charles-François Félix's methods, recently called heresy, were now studied. His curved scalpel became a model. Surgeons began to abandon cauterization and boiling oil. They started to excise tissues thoroughly, completely, and suture them. This changed the outcome of operations. Mortality from sepsis and shock began to fall. Patients who were previously condemned now had a real chance of survival. Statistics, if they had been kept then, would have shown a sharp increase. But the main thing was visible to the naked eye. People were recovering. Universities, once closed to surgeons, opened their doors. Anatomical theaters, where rare demonstrative dissections were previously performed, became centers of learning. Medical students, not just barber-surgeons, now studied the human body not from Galen, but through observation, through dissection. In 1731, almost half a century later, the Royal Academy of Surgery was founded, a direct consequence of Felix's success. Surgery gained its own independent status. It ceased to be an appendage to therapy. It became a distinct discipline with its own standards and research. Physician, therapists, the very ones who despised Felix, were forced to acknowledge the new reality. Their authority was shaken. They could no longer ignore the successes of surgeons. Medicine began slowly but surely to move away from dogma and scholasticism towards empiricism, observation, and experimentation. Louis XIV's fistula operation was a catalyst. It proved that progress does not always come from libraries. Sometimes it is born on the operating table, from despair, from courage, from a willingness to challenge established truths. This was not just a breakthrough. It was a revolution that changed the very understanding of what healing is and who has the right to perform it. Thus, from a single shameful royal illness, from the very heart of absolute monarchy, was born not just the triumph of one man, but also a profound paradox. Scientific progress, which we so often imagine as a chain of pure intellectual insights, here emerged from dirt and despair. Not the learned men debating humors, but a despised barber, surgeon whose hands were soiled with blood and pus, opened the way to a new era of healing. His method was not armchair research, but a brutal empiricism paid for by the pain of dozens of patients who had nothing left to lose. The story of Charles-François Félix is not just a chapter in the annals of medicine. It is an eternal reminder. Truth is often hidden, not in grand theories, but in harsh reality, in the willingness to reject dogmas and trust only direct observation. It was in this way, through royal suffering and the courage of one man, that surgery finally emerged from the shadow of a craft and took its rightful place in the pantheon of science. It was not an explosion of insights, but a slow, arduous ascent, where every step was hard, won, and every healing a more powerful argument than any treatment.